All right, so in this video, hopefully I can convince you that MCAT cars is not as hard as you may perceive it to be, and it's not as big of a nightmare as you may think. So we have a passage here. We have 5 questions, and we're going to go ahead and read the passage, do the questions, and hopefully by the end of this, you have a better understanding of the cars section and how to do better on it. So we're going to read this passage first. The first thing I always do before I read a passage is looking at this subtext here by Irving Howe. I don't know who that is. Distinctively modern novel from 1967. So maybe it's about a novel, and maybe the author claims that it's modern. You always want to be thinking about what the author is trying to say. So let's go ahead and start reading. At first glance, Jude the Obscure is not the kind of novel that compels one to reflect upon the idea of history, certainly not in the ways that Tolstoy's War and Peace or Stendhal's The Red and Black do. Okay, so at first glance means that it may appear that this novel, Jude the Obscure, I assume is the novel, may appear that it doesn't compel one to reflect upon history. But maybe the author will argue later on that since it is at first glance, maybe the author will argue later on that it only appears that way. And in fact, that's not true. So then it says, nor is it the kind of novel that draws our strongest attention to the causes, patterns, and turnings of the large historical trends as these condition the lives of a few central characters. So the author is saying it's at first glance is not either of these things. Then it says, the sense Jude leaves one with the quality of pain it afflicts has mostly to do with the sheer difficulty of human beings living together, elbow to elbow and heart to heart. So instead of talking about historical aspects like history, compelling one to reflect on history and drawing attention to these large historical trends, it deals with the quality of pain and the sheer difficulty human beings living together, elbow to elbow and heart to heart. So that's a good thing to know. This difficulty is one of being unable to bear prolonged isolation or prolonged closeness. So that is the difficulty they're talking about. It is the difficulty, at least for reflective men, of getting through the unspoken miseries of daily life. Yet to grasp the full tragedy of Jude's private ordeal, one must be aware of historical change, how the forces of history change the world around him. Okay, so it says that it's not initially talking about history, but this says here, yet it says it's tragedy, right? Obviously, there's some tragedy. It's talking about difficulty of humans living together and being unable to bear isolation is what the novel about, and getting through the unspoken miseries of daily life. But it says in order to grasp the full tragedy of the private ordeal, we must be aware of historical change. So that's why it's at first glance, right? Because it's saying that at first it doesn't appear like that, but if you want to grasp the full tragedy of Jude's private ordeal, which is part of the novel, I guess, we need to be aware of historical change. So how the forces of history change the world around him. Okay, so it's saying basically that it doesn't appear that it's about history, but the tragedy in the story is about history. Socially, Jude hovers somewhere between an old-fashioned artisan and a modern worker. The kind of work he does, restoring old churches, pertains to the traditional English past, but the way he does it, hiring himself out for wages, points to the future. So it says he hovers between old-fashioned and modern, and says the restoring old churches pertains to the traditional, but hiring himself out for wages points to the future. So it's talking about this is the traditional aspect, the old aspect, and the other one is the modern aspect. His desire for learning, both as a boy, trying to come by Greek grammar, and that as a man walking through the chill streets of Christminster, is portrayed by Hardy with enormous sympathy. Okay, and Hardy is the author, I suppose. Probably it's the author. And I mean the author of the novel, Jude the Obscure. That's what it seems like to me here, because it says it's portrayed by, and it says he's portrayed with enormous sympathy. So his desire for learning is portrayed by enormous sympathy. But to stress the sympathy is not at all to share the view of some critics that Hardy is so deeply involved with true yearnings that he cannot bring to bear upon them any critical irony. So to share the fact that the author is being sympathetic, supposedly, to this desire for learning, is not. So it's not at all to share the view. So that does not mean that some critics of Hardy are so deeply involved with Jude's yearnings that he cannot bring to bear upon them any critical irony. What does that mean? So Saying that Hardy, the author, is being sympathetic towards the situation does not mean that he cannot bear upon any irony. So, what is that talking about? Well, it says here Hardy often treats Jude ironically. Well, it says it immediately after. So, what but ironic is the incident in which Jude receives a crushing reply from the Christminster master, whom he has applied for advice? What but devastatingly ironic is the okay? So it's basically talking about uh, uh, types of like kinds of irony brought up in the story, right? So this is an ironic story and how ironically, the author is treating this character, this main character, and it's talking about, look, at this thing happened. You received a reply from a Christminster master whom you applied for advice, then flaunts his Latin before the good-natured, uncomprehending artisans at the Christminster tavern. So he spoke Latin even though they couldn't understand it. These were ironic situations, the author is claiming. Jude then is a balance of is a thoroughly individualized figure, an achievement made possible by Hardy's balance of sympathy and ironic distance. Interesting. So balance of sympathy and ironic distance. As we remember in the previous paragraph, they were talking about just because, just because Hardy treats the character with sympathy doesn't mean that he treats him ironically, right? So these are kind of two different things, basically. So that's why he says thoroughly individualized figure made an achievement made possible by balance of sympathy and ironic distance, so both and all. But Jude's personal tragedy is woven from the materials of historical change. So that's what it said earlier, right? It said something about you cannot, yeah. So in order to fully grasp the tragedy, you need to be aware of historical change and how the force of history changed the world around him. It's important in cars to remember what you read, and this is an example of that. So it says it's woven from the tragedy is woven from the materials of historical change, that transformation and uprooting of traditional English life. Jude is left without a place in his new world, and his tragedy comes from his attempts to fit in. Okay, so let's keep going. The same holds true for Jude's beloved Sue Bridehead. She's a triumph of psychological portraiture. The contours of her psychology, though, are themselves shaped by a new historical situation. So something about her psychology is shaped by something in a new historical situation. So maybe it's a new time or something, right? She could not possibly appear in a novel by Jane Austen or Charles Dickens or whoever this is. Her style of thought, her winsome charms, her maddening indecisions are all conditioned by the growth of intellectual skepticism and modernist sensibility. Okay, so these characteristics, I suppose, don't show up in these authors' writings. She's the first, and it also has something to do with a new historical situation. She's the first major anticipation in the English novel, the profoundly affecting and troublesome creature, the modern girl. So she's the first major anticipation of the English novel of that profoundly affecting and troublesome creature. So the modern girl is supposedly this troublesome creature. And that's what the author supposedly is telling us. She, like those later modern girls, follow her own mind, and this gets her into profound trouble. Okay, so this Sue Bridehead girl is modern, and she doesn't appear in these authors' writings, and it's a new time, and so she's modern, which is what the author is trying to say essentially. Okay. So this last paragraph says, in the last third of the 19th century, the situation of women changed radically. So it's kind of an extension of this, I guess, from subordinate domesticity and Victorian repression to the first signs of emancipation, leading often enough to the poignant bewilderments of a Sue Bridehead. Okay. So basically, from subordinate domesticity, so trying kind of being like submissive, and this repression to emancipation, like freedom, right? Leading often to the poignant bewilderments of a Sue Bridehead. So that Sue, and this is supposedly what Sue is like, right? She's emancipated, essentially. So that Sue, like Jude, is an intensely individualized figure. She's also a characteristic of a moment in recent history, which matches up with what we read, like a new historical situation, right? Recent history. Indeed, the force with which Hardy has made her so uniquely tragic depends on a great deal on the accuracy with which she has placed her historically. Okay. So what is that trying to say? Indeed, the force with which Hardy has made her so uniquely tragic depends on a great deal on the accuracy with. So essentially, what we're trying to display here is This tragicness is due once again to where he is placed her historically, which kind of we've heard over and over again, right? The tragedy and the situation is a direct cause of the historical aspect of the novel. Even though it says at first glance it's not the type of novel that compels one to reflect upon the idea of history. So again, it's very, very important in these Cars passages to read extremely carefully and be thinking really, really hard about what you're reading and what it means exactly. If you get lost, there's a very, very good chance that you're completely not going to get it 132 at all, right? You might get a lot of questions wrong. So we're going to do all these 5 questions, and we're going to try to apply what we learn in the passage. This says the passage implies what about which of the following about modern workers? It's very important to read the question, right? So what is the passage implying about modern workers? Well, we saw modern workers up here, right? We saw he's hovers somewhere between an old-fashioned artisan and a modern worker. So that's Jude. Jude is hovering somewhere here. The kind of work he does, so restoring old churches, it pertains to the traditional, but the way he does it, hiring himself out for wages, points to the future. So I see a very good choice, right? They're well educated, doesn't say anything about that. They hire them out for salaries, right? It says exactly that, right? It says that he sells himself out for wages. So it says exactly that about modern workers, right? They do not renovate buildings. It doesn't say that at all anywhere, right? Old fashioned artisan, modern worker, right? It doesn't say it says that, old-fashioned artisan restores old churches, but it doesn't say that uh, modern workers don't do that, and it doesn't say anything about creating products, right? So I'm gonna go with B. They hire them themselves out for salaries, and that's the correct answer. Okay, let's go to the next one. The passage discussion of Sue Brighthead, paragraph 6. Okay, so Sue Brighthead is the wife, I presume. I believe that's what it said, and it says paragraph 6. So where's paragraph 6? So one, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is a Sue Bridehead passage or paragraph, and it says it assumes that. So what is the assumption here? Number one, James. Okay, so we see all these 3 authors, right? We see Jane Austen, William Thackeray, right, and Dickens. So what does this sentence say? She could not possibly appear. So she being this modern girl, right? That's what it said about her. So she could not possibly appear in a novel by Jane Austen or Charles Dickens or William Thackeray. So that tells me that these authors don't write about modern girls. And that literally matches exactly one of the choices. Jane Austen's novels do not contain modern girls. Charles Dickens did not write about many women. It doesn't say that. It only says this modern girl, right? This new historical situation, this Sue Bridehead, she could not possibly appear in a novel by one of these people, right? So it doesn't say about women. It says about modern girls. Thackeray's women are simple and unassuming. This is what we might think, right? This is what we think in our minds of a non-modern girl, right? We think of simple, unassuming, but the MCAT doesn't care about what we think, right? It wants answers from a passage, right? It's literally exactly what the passage is saying, right? It's not you don't need to think critically about this. It does not contain modern girls. This is the answer, right? It says that verbatim in the passage. Thackeray's women are simple and unassuming. We don't have evidence of that. We don't see anywhere that modern girls are not simple and unassuming, right? Sue Bridehead did not live in a small rural village. It says absolutely, absolutely nothing about anywhere about small rural. But so this is again, C and D are our brains doing the work, right? And we want to rely solely on the passage. So let's continue. Solution. Okay. So, and we skipped this question actually. So, question 2 says, which the following is an assertion that is supported by strong evidence in the passage. So, something is supported. There's an assertion. It's very, very important again to read the questions extremely carefully, which is an assertion that is supported by strong evidence in the passage. So, there's something that is supported by strong evidence in the passage. There's maybe a lot of evidence. Jude the Obscure does not invite historical analysis. I did not hear anything about that in the passage. There is nowhere that says that it does not invite historical analysis. Hardy involves Jude in ironic situations. Yeah, B that is something that is supported by evidence. We saw right what but ironic is this? What but devastatingly ironic is that? So he gives 2 different pieces of evidence, and he says it verbatim. That's a pretty strongly supported thing. Jude has no clear place in the world. Uh, he said that, right? He just said Jude is left without a place in the world. but he didn't give evidence for that. He simply said it, right? He just said, but Jude's personal tragedy is woven from historical change. Um, and it just says he's left without a place in the world. Um, it doesn't say anything about why that might be the case. It just says that this is the case. He has no clear place in the world. And so you might be tempted by C and you might be thinking, oh, is it C? Is it B? Like, what do I do? But it says which is supported by strong evidence, right? If you read the question, you can understand B is supported by evidence and C is not supported by evidence. So B is a better choice than C. Okay, what about D? Jude the Obscure portrays the pain of people living together. Again, it says that, right? It says that human beings living together, but where in the passage does it support that, right? So B is supported extremely well. It's given multiple pieces of evidence. And C and D, maybe that the author said that, but the author didn't provide strong evidence, right? And A is completely wrong. So I'm going to go with B. Now, 4, of the following statements, which one best describes the central focus of the passage? So what did we say? We said something about at first glance, it's not the kind of passage to talk about history, but then you read it over and over again, and you think, well, if you want to understand the tragedy of it, the author keeps saying that, right? The tragedy is based on historical context. So Jude the Obscure is a traditional historical novel. That doesn't make any sense to me. The author actually contradicted that. He said that at first glance it does not seem like that. B. Jude the Obscure is a tragic novel. That could be the case. It is a tragic novel, but is that the central focus of the passage? Is it talking about how tragic it is? I don't believe that is the case. The tragedy in Jude the Obscure is historical in nature, right? C says there is tragedy, but that tragedy is historical. There are so many places where he said that, right? To grasp the full tragedy of Jude's private ordeal, we must be aware of historical change. And it said that several other times, right? I believe in the latter part of the passage, right? So the tragedy depends a great deal on where he has placed her historically, and he said it several times in the passage. So I believe this fits in with what I believe the central theme is. Jude and Jude the Obscure is both a traditional. That's completely, that zero evidence for that. We cannot say that at all. I'm going to go with C, and let's go to the next question. The final question is, the passage describes an irony in Jude the Obscure. Namely that, okay, so it does describe an irony, right? There's verbatim, we saw irony here. He treats Jude ironically. These are two cases of irony, right? We cannot possibly mess this up if we understand how to read the passage. The more educated Jude is, the worse his job prospects get. Okay, it doesn't say anything about education, right? Does it say anything here about education? No, it doesn't. We cannot come to that conclusion. As independent as Sue Bridehead may be, she still seeks to find a husband. It doesn't say that she still seeks to find a husband, right? It says that she's independent. I believe it says that she's independent, but it does not say that she seeks to find a husband. That cannot be true. It never said that anywhere. See, Jude tries to impress people by speaking a language they don't understand. Didn't it say that verbatim here, right? What but devastating ironic is the scene in which Jude flaunts his Latin before the good-natured, uncomprehending, which means doesn't understand, uncomprehending artisans at the Christ Minister, I guess it's Christ Minister. I've been saying Christ Minister this whole time. It's Christ Minister, I guess. He flaunts his Latin, which means he speaks Latin to people that don't understand it, right? So C is exactly an irony. Passage describes an irony, and that is one of the ironies that the passage describes, right? What but devastating ironic is that, right? So it's got to be C. D says traditional English life is never quite depicted clearly in the book. I don't see how that's an irony. Does not make sense to me why that would be ironic, right? It just describes an irony. A and B seem like ironies, but we can't draw those conclusions, and C is a verbatim irony that was mentioned in the passage. So we managed to get all of these questions correct. All we did, right? We didn't do anything fancy. We just read the passage. We thought about it. We thought about it at surface level. We understood that we had to read the questions extremely deeply. We had to understand the passage, right? We had to make sure we take the questions very, very literally. And exactly what was in the passage were reflected by the questions, right? So it's nothing crazy. It's not, as hard as maybe it's made out to be. It's much simpler than you may think. So with that being said, I'll see you guys next time for another Cars Deep Dive.